Imagine being forced to watch yourself die, to see your body torn apart, to smell your own burning flesh, to witness your soul leave in pieces. This was not a nightmare. It was justice, English justice, in the Middle Ages. A ritual so calculated that every scream had meaning, every cut, a message from the crown itself. For centuries, England perfected a punishment so gruesome that even executioners prayed never to perform it. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was to suffer 3 deaths in one, each more agonizing than the last. But how did a nation famed for its laws invent a death that defied all mercy? The execution where you were forced to watch yourself die. In the 13th century, England stood as a kingdom forged by conquest and held together by fear. The throne was not merely a seat of power, it was a divine altar. The king ruled not by human consent, but by the will of God himself. To betray the crown was to betray the divine. Treason was not a crime of politics, it was blasphemy, an assault on heaven's chosen order. The first to face this unholy justice was William de Morisco, a pirate accused of plotting against King Henry III in 1242. Dragged from the Tower of London, his sentence was written in a new language of terror, to be drawn to his death, hanged until nearly dead and then dismembered, his body offered as proof that rebellion could not survive the king's wrath. This was no simple execution. It was a ceremony, a public performance of divine vengeance. Each stage carefully crafted to humiliate, to desecrate, to remind every witness that the body of a traitor belonged not to himself, but to the crown. 40 years later the ritual became law. In 1283, Dafydd ap Gruffydd, the last native prince of Wales, was captured after rebelling against King Edward I. His death would set the pattern for centuries. Edward ordered that the prince be dragged through the streets, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered, each act symbolizing a different betrayal. The drawing showed his degradation. The hanging, the theft of life from his sovereign. The cutting open of the body, the exposure of inner treachery. The scattering of his limbs, a warning carried to the far corners of the realm. From that day England's justice no longer ended with death. It began there. By 1351, this ritual had found its scripture, the Treason Act. Its words were cold, methodical, precise. That you be drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck and being alive cut down. Your privy members shall be cut off, your bowels taken out and burned before you. Your head severed, your body divided into 4 quarters, to be disposed of at the king's pleasure. This was not madness. It was order. A system so meticulous that cruelty became law, and law became holy. In a world where thrones teetered on rebellion and faith-fractured kingdoms, fear was the only glue strong enough to hold a nation together. The crown ruled through theater, and the stage was built from human flesh. Dragged through mud. Hung but not killed. Cut, burned, and divided as the kingdom watched. But the horror didn't end at death, it began long before the first cut. The night before execution was its own kind of death. In the silence of the tower, time became torture. The condemned man would lie awake, listening to the slow drip of water, the rattle of chains, the shuffle of guards outside his cell. They didn't just kill you. They made you imagine every detail first. Some prayed. Some confessed. Others simply waited, eyes open, staring into darkness, picturing the rope, the fire, the knife. Few ever slept. By dawn, the man was already broken. His body still whole, but his mind, already quartered. The morning began not with mercy, but humiliation. The condemned was tied to a hurdle, a plank of wood like a butcher's tray, and dragged through the streets from his cell to the gallows. The route was chosen with care, winding through crowded markets and open squares. Children on rooftops, mothers clutching bread, beggars watching in silence. Everyone had to see what justice looked like. He was pulled face down through the filth of the city, the stones, the refuse, the jeers. You arrived at your death already half dead. Every jolt sent pain shooting through his spine. Every insult reminded him he no longer belonged to himself. Even the air he breathed now belonged to the king. But what awaited him at the gallows made the journey seem merciful. The hanging was not meant to kill. It was meant to remind him that death was still a privilege the crown could delay. The rope was short by design, just long enough to choke, not to break. The drop was shallow. The body convulsed, suspended between life and death. The crowd watched in silence, counting the seconds, until the struggle slowed and the body hung limp. And when you thought it was over, they cut you down. He was alive. Barely. Alive enough for what came next. But even death couldn't end their suffering. Now came the true theater. The executioner was both priest and performer. His altar, the human body. With practiced precision he reached for the blade. The emasculation came first, a strike not meant to kill but to degrade. A final theft of dignity before the flesh was opened. The severed parts were thrown into the flames, the smell of burning flesh rising over the murmurs. The condemned watched if he could. He was being erased piece by piece. Then came the incision, a line drawn down the abdomen, deliberate, cruelly careful. The executioner's hands reached into the body, pulling life out in ribbons. Witnesses said some men stayed conscious, even speaking as their hearts were taken. In 1484, William Collingbourne, condemned for mocking King Richard III, cried out, "O Lord Jesus, yet more trouble," as the executioner reached into his chest. You watched the executioner lift your own heart into the fire. The body dying, the mind refusing to let go. When life finally slipped away, the next act began. The head was severed and lifted high for the crowd to see. "Behold the head of a traitor." The words echoed across the square. But the ritual was not complete. The body was divided, hacked into 4 parts, each destined for a different city. The remains would be parboiled in salt and spices to delay decay, then mounted on gates and bridges as silent sentinels of royal power. Even in death, the traitor served the crown. His flesh turned into warning, his memory into message. For the traitor's body was only the beginning of the story. This was not punishment in private. It was theater, raw, public, alive. A nation gathered to witness what it meant to defy the king. Some cheered. Some vomited. Others fainted where they stood. The smell of smoke and blood clung to clothes for days. The sound of screams lingered in dreams for years. Children were brought to watch, to learn obedience through terror. The lesson was simple. Loyalty was survival. Even the executioner felt the tension of his role, part servant, part monster, part messenger of divine justice. Every stroke of his blade had to be perfect. Every second calibrated between agony and audience. Here death was no longer an end. It was propaganda. The crowd returned home whispering what they saw, retelling it in taverns, in churches, in kitchens. The story multiplied, spreading the fear the crown required. They called it justice. But standing in that crowd, watching a man torn apart by law, who could still tell the difference between justice and spectacle? By the time the last limb was cut and the fire had gone out, the real performance was only beginning. For the execution did not end with death, it began there. The body itself became the message. The state understood what fear could not achieve through words, it could carve directly into flesh. The body was a message written in blood, loyalty enforced through terror. The limbs of the condemned were parboiled, simmered in salt and cumin, the same spices used to preserve meat for soldiers. It wasn't mercy. It was maintenance. The king's warnings had to last. Above the Thames, the heads of traitors rotted in the open air. The stench of boiled flesh mixed with the smell of the river, a perfume of power that lingered for months. Each head faced the city like a sermon. This is what rebellion looks like. But the more they displayed the dead, the more powerful the dead became. In 1305, William Wallace, Scotland's defiant son, was dragged through London, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered. His head placed on London Bridge, his limbs scattered to the corners of the realm. The message was clear: Scotland's resistance was over. But it had the opposite effect. His execution ignited the very flame it was meant to extinguish. The man they called traitor became a legend, a ghost that no gallows could silence. 20 years later, another body fed the fire of spectacle. Hugh Despenser, the king's favorite, the most hated man in England, was dragged before a mob in Hereford. Verses condemning him were carved into his skin. A crown of nettles pressed onto his head. He was hanged, cut down alive, and opened from throat to groin. His execution so savage that even his enemies were said to look away. It was justice turned frenzy, the line between punishment and revenge erased beneath the roar of the crowd. But this was not the last time horror would wear the mask of justice. 3 centuries later, in 1605, Guy Fawkes was caught with enough gunpowder to erase the monarchy in one blast. He was tortured on the rack until his signature broke into a trembling scrawl, the mark of a man unmade. Too weak to stand, he climbed to the noose and leapt. The fall snapped his neck before the knife could find him. In that single act, he stole the executioner's power and denied the crowd their theater. Yet his legend lived longer than any display. Each year, the English set fire to the sky in memory of the man they meant to erase. Every death meant to crush rebellion only forged new martyrs. Every scream meant to silence faith gave it voice. And every execution meant to sanctify the crown stained it a little darker. The theater of power became the theater of pity. The victim's courage rewrote the script, turning punishment into legend, cruelty into cause. But there was still one more audience to please, the people themselves. In the end, the crown needed the crowd as much as the blade. Without witnesses, there was no message. Without awe, no authority. But as centuries passed, the question began to whisper beneath the spectacle. When justice becomes entertainment, who is truly guilty, the traitor or the crowd that cheers his death? The echoes of that theater still linger, in the way power shows itself, in the punishments we still watch. The stage has changed. The lesson has not. For 6 centuries, the scaffold ruled England's imagination. But even cruelty has an expiration date. The Enlightenment dawned, an age that promised reason over ritual, compassion over spectacle. The philosophers began to ask the forbidden. What does it say of a civilization that entertains itself with agony? The answer came slowly, not in mercy but in exhaustion. In 1782, a Scottish spy named David Tyrie was sentenced to the full punishment, the last man in Britain to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. He hung for 23 minutes before the knife began its work. The witnesses, hardened by centuries of violence, turned away. Some wept. Others prayed that they would never see its like again. Even the newspapers called it barbaric, a word almost never used before to describe the king's justice. After Tyrie's death, the tide began to turn. Public executions grew quieter. Judges hesitated to speak the old words aloud. The spectacle had become an embarrassment, a relic of a darker mind. In 1870, Parliament finally struck the words from the law. No more drawing. No more quartering. The Treason Act rewritten. It took 6 centuries to end. The gallows that once commanded thousands were torn down. The fires went cold. Execution moved indoors, private, mechanical, stripped of pageantry. Justice retreated behind closed doors. Humanity had learned to hide its cruelty, not erase it. But even buried traditions leave ghosts. Tyburn is now a roundabout. London Bridge sells postcards. The blood has dried, but the story hasn't. Tourists walk where thousands once gathered to watch a man's final breath. Children eat ice cream on the same ground where bodies burned. The horror has been repaved but never erased. Even the word survives, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. A phrase spoken in jest, emptied of its meaning, yet carrying the ghost of every scream that once gave it power. History doesn't vanish. It mutates, hiding cruelty beneath civility, turning blood into heritage. Perhaps the real horror isn't that they killed so cruelly, but that they called it justice. And as centuries pass, the line between punishment and performance still blurs. We no longer gather at the scaffold, but we still watch. We still judge. And somewhere, in every system that trades fear for obedience, the spirit of Tyburn still breathes. This is Disturbing Tales, where history isn't told, it's resurrected. If you felt this story, subscribe, not for me but for those history tried to erase. And remember, cruelty doesn't die. It only learns to hide. The gallows are gone. The fires have long gone cold. But history still whispers through the stones of this city. And as the wind passes over Tyburn, the echoes of their screams remind us. Cruelty needs only law to make it righteous. This is Disturbing Tales, where history isn't told, it's resurrected. Beat of silence, 1 second. If you felt this story, subscribe, not for me, but for those history tried to erase.